The salt spray tasted of rust and impending failure. Alex Thorne felt it atomize against his sunburnt, raw-feeling face, a gritty, corrosive mist that coated his lips and stung the raw corners of his eyes. It was a tangible testament to the sputtering death rattle of the two-stroke Evinrude 50-horsepower engine behind him. The sound, a frantic, metallic cough that had been his only companion since dawn, broke over the placid, mercury-like expanse of the Florida Straits. Finally died with a single, pathetic gasp. Its absence created a void, a profound and terrifying silence that was immediately violated by a new sound, the one he had been dreading since the first pale, anemic light had breached the horizon. It was the low, hungry growl of a powerful diesel engine, a predator's thrum that resonated through the worn fiberglass hull of the tired little fishing skiff and vibrated up through the thin soles of his worn Sperry-deck shoes into the very bones of his feet. He didn't need to turn around. He had the silhouette memorized from dozens of intelligence briefings in sterile, windowless rooms back in Langley. The kind of rooms that smelled of institutional floor wax and circulated air. A Soviet-made Komar-class patrol boat, Project 183R. A fast, ugly, brutally functional craft, bristling with intent, its distinctive P-15 Termit missile tubes giving it a hunched, aggressive posture like a bulldog. They were still in international waters, just a technicality. A line on a map that meant everything in a courtroom in The Hague and absolutely nothing out here, under the indifferent, blistering gaze of a sun that was already beginning to cook the air. The men on that boat, members of the Cuban Revolutionary Navy, didn't care for the niceties of maritime law. They cared for the invisible line in the turquoise water that separated their world from his, and he was dancing on it with a dead engine and a heart that had plummeted into the pit of his stomach. His knuckles were bone white where he gripped the splintered, sun-bleached gunwale. The wood was hot to the touch, baked by the morning heat, and felt like it might crumble to dust under his grip. He was supposed to be a ghost, a whisper, a footnote in a file that didn't officially exist. Instead, he was a sitting duck, his meticulously planned infiltration turning into a very public, very final capture. His cover story, a disgruntled Canadian software salesman named Alistair Grote, who'd impulsively rented a boat in Marathon for a bit of deep-sea fishing and gotten hopelessly lost, was tissue-thin, designed to withstand the cursory questioning of a bored harbor master. Not the focused, methodical deconstruction it would face from the Dirección General de Inteligencia, the DGI, Cuba's formidable and notoriously thorough state security service, did not believe in coincidences, and they certainly didn't believe in Canadian software salesmen with the kind of military-grade calluses on their hands that came from years of weapons training, or the faint, perfectly straight scar that ran along his jawline from a knife fight in a Berlin alley. The patrol boat was on him now, a gray shark carving a crisp white wake through the otherwise placid sea. He could make out the figures on the deck, their olive-green uniforms stark against the blinding glare of the sun reflecting off the water. A naval mount on the bow, a twin-barreled 2M3 25mm cannon, swiveled with an unnerving, hydraulic smoothness to point directly at his chest. A black, unblinking eye of judgment. A voice, amplified by a bullhorn, cracked across the water, the Spanish harsh and distorted by the cheap electronics. Alto, no se mueva, apague el motor y levante las manos. Stop, don't move. Turn off the engine and raise your hands. Alex almost laughed, a dry, humorless rasp in his parched throat. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, feeling the sun warm his face, a stark contrast to the ice forming in his gut. He thought of Frank Donaldson, his handler, back in the refrigerated anonymity of a Langley sub-basement. Frank with his ill-fitting Sears suits that always seemed a size too small, the constant scent of stale coffee and profound disappointment clinging to him like a shroud. "The objective is subtlety, Thorne," he'd said, his thick, nicotine-stained finger tapping a glossy satellite photo of a sprawling complex in Pinar del Rio. "We don't want to bang. We want to whisper. We want a joke that only we understand. The president is tired of Castro making him look like a fool. He wants to return the favor. We're not making a martyr. We're making a punchline." It had all sounded so clean, so surgical, back in that soundproofed room filled with the low hum of air conditioning and the smell of ozone from the servers. This was Operation Mockingbird's angrier, more personal cousin. The fallout from the Bay of Pigs was still a raw, open wound in the Kennedy administration. They had tried to knock the king off his throne with force and failed spectacularly. Now, they were resorting to poison pen letters and whoopee cushions on a geopolitical scale. The mission wasn't to kill Fidel. It was to chemically unravel him, just for a moment, in front of the people who mattered most. To make the unshakable Comandante appear weak, unstable, perhaps even mad. The weapon of choice wasn't a bomb or a bullet. It was a cigar. Specifically, one from the first, most prized batch of a new brand, the Cohiba, rolled exclusively for Castro and his inner circle in a converted mansion in the El Laguito district of Havana. But the real work, the blending of the tobacco, the curing of the priceless leaves, happened at the source, in a state-run factory in the Vuelta Abajo region. That was his target. The Cuban sailors were boarding his skiff now, their movements efficient and devoid of wasted motion, their faces grim and professional under the brims of their caps. They carried Czech VZ-58 rifles, the gray phosphated metalwork glinting dully in the sun, a far more businesslike weapon than the common AK-47. They prodded him into the stern with their muzzles, their eyes scanning every inch of the boat, then every inch of him. They found the false bottom in his tackle box, of course. It was an amateurish trick, a last resort for exfiltration gear, not infiltration. It clicked open with a cheap sound to reveal not fishing lures, but a compact, high-frequency Collins PRC-66 radio, a set of titanium lockpicks that looked like dental tools, and a small, lead-lined vial containing a clear, odorless liquid. The game was up before it had even begun. As they slapped cold steel cuffs on his wrists, the metal biting into his sunburnt skin, Alex met the eyes of the Cuban officer in charge. The man's gaze was cold, intelligent, and utterly devoid of triumph. There was only a weary professionalism that was far more terrifying than any overt hostility. In that moment, Alex knew his Canadian tourist act was dead on arrival. He was an enemy of the state. He was property of the DGI. His mind raced, not with fear, but with a cold, analytical fury. The mission was compromised. The entire support network, the safe houses, the contacts, was now at risk. And a woman named Elena Rojas, a roller in the factory whose face he had only ever seen in a grainy, overexposed photograph, was now in unimaginable danger because of his failure. The salt spray on his lips no longer tasted of failure. It tasted like a death sentence, not just for him, but for her. The interrogation room at Villa Marista, the DGI's infamous headquarters, was a perfect cliché of totalitarian architecture. It was cold, damp, and smelled of mildew, cheap disinfectant, and generations of settled fear. A single bare 40-watt bulb hung from a frayed cloth-wrapped wire, casting long, dancing shadows that made the small, windowless space feel both claustrophobic and vast. His interrogator was the same officer from the boat. He introduced himself as Captain Vargas. He was lean, with the sharp, predatory features of a hawk and eyes that seemed to miss nothing, cataloging every flicker of Alex's expression, every subtle shift in his posture. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. That was worse. He spoke in a low, conversational tone, his Spanish precise and educated, as if they were two old colleagues discussing a minor professional disagreement. "Your Spanish is very good, mister." Vargas let the question hang in the air, a baited hook. He sat opposite Alex at a scarred wooden table, slowly lighting a Cuban cigarette, a Populares sin filtro. The smoke was acrid and unfiltered, the smell of the common man, a deliberate choice. The flare of the match illuminated his sharp cheekbones for a moment. He offered the pack to Alex, a small gesture of faux camaraderie. Alex ignored the gesture, his mind already a fortress. He began reciting the starting lineup for the 1961 New York Yankees, a mental trick to occupy the frontal lobe, to build a wall against the psychological pressure. Mantle, center field; Maris, right field; Berra, catcher; Ford, pitcher. Vargas smiled, a thin, humorless stretching of his lips that did not reach his eyes. He exhaled a plume of blue-gray smoke. The silent American. A cliché but a respectable one. You are CIA, of course. The PRC-66 radio tells us that. Tuned to the 34.5 megahertz band, a frequency your agency favors for maritime drops in this sector. The question is not who you are, but what you were sent to do. Sabotage? Assassination? He leaned forward, the cheap wood of his chair creaking under his weight. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Another attempt on El Comandante's life? Your agency is persistent. I will grant you that. Obsessed, even. It is almost a sickness. Alex stared at a crack in the concrete wall behind Vargas's head. He focused on its shape, a jagged line like a miniature river delta. He had to give them nothing. Every word was a potential betrayal of someone else. Elena, the safe housekeeper in Havana, the fisherman who was supposed to have picked him up, Scowron, first base, Richardson, second, Kubek, shortstop. Days bled into one another in a gray, timeless fog. They deprived him of sleep, using erratic, discordant noises. A dripping tap amplified through a hidden speaker to a maddening crash, a guard dragging a metal chair across the concrete floor above his cell at unpredictable intervals. The questioning was relentless, a psychological siege. Vargas was a master of his craft. He would alternate between feigned sympathy, intellectual debate about the merits of revolution versus imperialism, and cold, precise threats against the people he might know. He never laid a hand on Alex, but his words were like scalpels, trying to peel back the layers of his training, searching for a single, exploitable nerve. And then, one morning, after what felt like an eternity, the cell door opened with a groan of tortured metal. It wasn't Vargas. It was a stout man in an ill-fitting, shiny polyester suit, flanked by two armed guards. He had the unmistakable pallor of a man who spent his life indoors under fluorescent lights. A functionary, a bureaucrat. He spoke with a thick, phlegmy Russian accent. You are being released. Alex stared, uncomprehending. His sleep-deprived brain struggled to process the words. It was a trick, a new phase of the interrogation. A trade, the Russian said, clearly enjoying Alex's confusion. He held a file in his hand, tapping it against his thigh. A small gesture of goodwill between great powers. We have one of yours. You have one of ours. A pilot, you may have heard of him, a Mr. Powers, shot down over our territory in his fancy spy plane. Your government is very eager to have him back. And our government has an interest in seeing a certain Colonel Abel return to us. You, my friend, are how do you say, the sweetener in the deal. A low-level agent caught in a fishing boat. An embarrassment your president would like to quietly disappear. It was surreal. He was being bundled out of Villa Marista, blinking in the harsh, painful sunlight that felt like needles in his eyes. His freedom traded for a U-2 pilot and a master Soviet spy on a bridge in Berlin. He was a pawn, a throwaway piece in a much larger game. His failed mission, his capture, it was all being swept under the rug of grand geopolitics. He was being given a second chance he hadn't earned and didn't deserve. Back in Langley, the debriefing was brutal. Frank was apoplectic, his face a mottled, unhealthy red. "You were compromised before you even hit the beach, Thorne. A complete and utter disaster," he roared, slamming a thick file onto his metal desk, making the half-empty coffee mug jump and slosh cold liquid onto a stack of papers. "The engine was sabotaged, Frank," Alex said, his voice a low rasp from disuse. "The fuel line was crimped with pliers, just enough to starve the carburetor after an hour at full throttle. It was too clean. Someone knew my route and my timetable." "Or you got sloppy," Frank shot back. But there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He hated the idea of a leak more than he hated failure. The failure was hung around Alex's neck like an albatross. He was relegated to a desk in the sub-basement, a purgatory of paperwork where disgraced agents went to die. He spent his days analyzing satellite photos of cane fields and shipping manifests, the stench of his failure clinging to him. The whispers followed him down the linoleum hallways. He was the agent who'd been caught and then, inexplicably, traded back. A pariah. But Alex wasn't thinking about his career. He was thinking about Elena. Her file was now stamped in red ink, asset compromised. Terminate contact. To the agency, she was a loose end, a liability. To Alex, she was a ghost that haunted his waking hours. He had memorized her photograph, the quiet dignity in her eyes, the subtle defiance in the set of her jaw. She was risking her life for a brother in Castro's prisons, a promise the CIA would almost certainly never keep. And he had failed her. 6 months passed. The world moved on. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the planet to the brink of annihilation and then pulled it back, leaving everyone shaken and paranoid. The Kennedys' obsession with Castro only intensified, becoming something deeply personal, pathologically so. The whispers of Operation Mongoose grew louder again. The plots became more outlandish, exploding seashells, poisoned wetsuits. And then, Frank called Alex into his office. The door was closed. The blinds were drawn. "The Cuba desk is being reactivated," Frank said without preamble. He pushed a thin manila file across the desk. It had a single word stamped on the cover in stark black letters. Humidor. Alex opened it. Inside were detailed schematics of the El Corojo Magnifico factory in Pinar del Rio, and a new photograph of Elena, taken a month ago by a tourist from a distance. She looked thinner, more tired, but the defiance was still there, etched into her face like a woodcut. "We're going back in," Frank said. "The mission is the same. Embarrass the man. But the method is different. Better. Subtler." "I was compromised," Alex said flatly. "They have my face, my prints, my biometrics. They have the face of Alistair Grote, a clumsy Canadian tourist who tried a clumsy infiltration by sea. You were a nobody. You were traded away for nothing. They think they know who you are, and they think you're an idiot," Frank countered, a rare spark of cunning in his eyes. "Which is why you're perfect. You're going back in, but not as a ghost in a fishing boat. You're going in through the front door. The plan was audacious, bordering on insane, Alex Thorne would cease to exist. In his place would be Mr. Alistair Finch, a fastidious, slightly eccentric tobacco buyer from a prestigious London firm, Holland and Finch. He would be an expert in leaf quality, in fermentation, in the delicate art of the cigar. His cover was immaculate, built over a year by MI6 as a personal favor to the director. He had a credit history, a flat in Kensington, a membership at a gentleman's club. He had deeply held opinions on cricket and the proper way to brew tea. Alistair Finch was more real than Alex Thorne had been in years. His mission was to get inside the El Corojo Magnifico factory, not as a saboteur, but as a legitimate, invited guest. The Cuban government, desperate for hard currency, was beginning to court foreign buyers for its lesser-known cigar brands. Finch's firm was interested in a bulk purchase. It was the perfect pretext to gain access. Once inside, he had two objectives. First, re-establish contact with Elena. The new signal was absurdly simple, a piece of theatrical nonsense chosen for its distinctiveness. In his conversations with the factory manager, he was to use the phrase, "The rain in Spain stays mainly on the plain," a line from My Fair Lady. If Elena was still active and willing, she would respond by dropping a wooden cigar mold on the floor. It was a long shot. She might have been arrested or simply lost her nerve. His second objective was the payload. The vial of clear liquid from his first attempt was deemed too crude. The new weapon was a work of dark genius from the Technical Services Division. It wasn't a poison. It was a powerful, refined psychoactive chemical derived from 3-quinaclidinyl benzylate, known in-house as BZ. It was odorless, tasteless, and crucially, heat-activated. In its inert state, it was harmless. But when heated to the temperature of a burning cigar ember, approximately 700 degrees Celsius, it would aerosolize in the smoke, delivering a potent dose of disorientation, acute paranoia, and vivid auditory and visual hallucinations to the smoker. The effects would last for about an hour, leaving no traceable residue in the bloodstream. The target wouldn't die. He would simply, for a short time, lose his mind. The delivery system was even more elegant. No more crude vials. Instead, TSD had developed a device that looked exactly like a high-end Mont Blanc Meisterstuck fountain pen. But instead of ink, its reservoir held the BZ compound. The nib was a marvel of microengineering. When pressed against a porous surface, like a tobacco leaf, it didn't write. It delivered a single, precisely measured micro-droplet of the chemical, which would be absorbed instantly, leaving no visible trace. The plan was to identify the specific batch of tobacco leaves, the rare, prized medio tiempo leaves, used exclusively for the Comandante's personal cigars. Elena's job as a torcedora, a master roller, gave her access to the rolling floor and, hopefully, the knowledge to identify that specific batch. Alex, as Finch, would create a diversion, and Elena would use the pen to dose a handful of the filler leaves. Those leaves would then be rolled into the cigars, banded, boxed, and sent to Havana, a ticking psychological time bomb waiting in Fidel Castro's humidor. The flight to Havana was a step through the looking glass. Alex, now fully inhabiting the persona of Alistair Finch, wore a heavy tweed jacket despite the oppressive tropical heat. He carried a leather briefcase and a copy of the Times. He felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. But on the surface, he was the picture of British unflappability. He was met at Jose Marti Airport, not by the DGI, but by a representative from Cuba Tobacco, the state tobacco monopoly. A man named Senor Mendoza, plump, sweating profusely through his guayabera, and desperate to make a sale. The drive to Pinar del Rio was a journey back in time, Gleaming American cars from the 50s. Bel Airs, Fairlanes, Studebakers, held together with wire and hope, rumbled past fields of sugarcane and towering royal palms. The air grew thick and sweet with the smell of the land, the rich, loamy scent of the world's finest tobacco soil. They passed the famous triangular-roofed curing barns, the casas de tabaco, where the leaves hung like sleeping bats, slowly turning from vibrant green to a rich, mottled brown. The El Corojo Magnifico factory was a grand, colonial-era building, its yellow paint peeling in the humid air, a faded monument to a bygone era. As Alex stepped out of the car, he felt a profound chill despite the heat. He was walking into the lion's den, armed with a fountain pen and a ridiculous line from a musical. The factory manager, a stern party loyalist named Diaz, greeted him with a handshake and a forced, bureaucratic smile. And standing just behind him, a shadow in the doorway, was Captain Vargas. Alex's blood ran cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his face remained a placid mask of polite British curiosity. Vargas's eyes, those sharp, intelligent hawk's eyes, swept over him. There wasn't a flash of recognition, but something worse. A predator's instinct, a palpable sense that something was out of place. "Captain Vargas," Diaz said, "is our head of security. He takes a personal interest in all our foreign visitors." "Of course," Alex said, extending a hand. His voice was a perfect imitation of a clipped, upper-class British accent he had practiced for months. "A pleasure, Captain. One can't be too careful with such a valuable commodity." Vargas took his hand. The grip was firm, the eyes searching, dissecting. "We have had incidents in the past, Senor Finch. We are vigilant." The message was brutally clear. "I remember the man in the fishing boat. I am watching you." The tour of the factory was a slow, agonizing dance. Diaz droned on about fermentation periods and leaf quality, while Vargas trailed them, a silent, menacing presence. Alex played his part to perfection, making meticulous notes in a small leather-bound book, asking esoteric questions about the volado, seco, and ligero leaves, the three types that make up the filler of a cigar. All the while, his eyes scanned the vast, open-plan rolling room. The galera, hundreds of men and women, sat at wooden desks, their fingers a blur of motion as they transformed the supple leaves into perfect cylinders. The air was thick with the scent of raw tobacco and the rhythmic sound of hundreds of chavetas. The rollers' rounded knives rocking on the tables. He was looking for one face in the crowd. He saw her, Elena. She was exactly as she looked in the photograph, but the still image hadn't captured the deep weariness in her posture, the fine lines of worry etched around her eyes. She didn't look up. Her focus was entirely on the leaves in front of her, her hands moving with an ingrained, hypnotic grace. Now came the moment of truth. As Diaz pointed out a stack of cedar boards used for aging, Alex turned to him, his voice projecting just enough to carry over the noise of the room. "It is quite remarkable, Senor Diaz. The climate here is so specific. I am reminded of a line from a play. The rain in Spain stays mainly on the plain." A curious phrase, but it speaks to the importance of geography, does it not? He held his breath. He saw Elena's hands hesitate for a fraction of a second. Her rhythm was broken. Vargas, standing a few feet away, narrowed his eyes. He had noticed the pause. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Alex felt a single bead of sweat trickle down his temple. He had made a mistake. The signal was too obvious, too theatrical. And then it happened. A wooden cigar mold, a simple two-part press, slipped from the edge of Elena's workbench and clattered onto the concrete floor. The sound was sharp, definitive, yet perfectly natural. She didn't look at him. She simply bent down, retrieved the mold with a sigh of mild annoyance, and went back to her work. But the message had been sent. The asset was active. The mission was on. The next 2 days were a masterclass in espionage tradecraft, a silent, deadly ballet conducted under the ever-watchful eyes of Captain Vargas. Alex, as Finch, had to establish a reason to be alone, to create a window of opportunity. He complained of a delicate stomach, a common ailment for foreigners unaccustomed to the local water, and made frequent, lengthy trips to the lavatory. It was there, in a stall at the far end with a dripping cistern, that the first dead drop took place. Taped to the cold, sweating underside of the porcelain water tank was a single, tightly folded tobacco leaf. He slipped it into his pocket. Later, back in the relative safety of his hotel room, he carefully unrolled it. Scratched into the soft, leathery surface with a pin were 2 words: Medio tiempo, jueves, Thursday. The rare leaves would be on the rolling floor on Thursday. He needed to get the pen to her. Another dead drop was too risky. Vargas was practically his shadow. He had to use a live drop, a brush pass. It was the most dangerous maneuver in the spy's playbook. The next day, during the tour, he feigned a dizzy spell, blaming the heat and the powerful, nose-stinging aroma of ammonia from the fermentation room. As he stumbled, he brushed against a trolley of finished cigars being pushed by a young boy. The Mont Blanc pen flew from his breast pocket and skittered across the floor, coming to rest near Elena's workstation. "Oh, bother," Alex exclaimed, leaning against a pillar for support, playing the part of the frail Englishman. "My pen. Terribly clumsy of me." Diaz immediately began to fuss and apologize. Vargas's eyes, however, were not on Alex. They were on the pen and on Elena. Alex saw the cold calculation in the captain's gaze. He was testing her, testing them both. Elena did not move. She continued her work, her face a mask of sublime concentration. It was another worker, an older man with a deeply lined face 2 tables down, who stood up, walked over, picked up the pen, and handed it back to Alex with a polite, deferential smile. Alex felt a surge of cold despair. It hadn't worked. The opportunity was lost. But as he took the pen, his fingers brushed the man's. He felt a tiny, sharp prick. Tucked into the man's calloused palm was a pin, a signal. He looked at the man's face, a simple, anonymous factory worker. This was Elena's cutout, a member of her own small, invisible network. The CIA, in all its wisdom, had never known he existed. That night, a note was slipped under his hotel room door. Lavanderia. 6 de la mañana. The laundry. 6 a.m. The hotel laundry was in the basement. A steamy, cavernous room filled with ancient, rumbling machines that sounded like a freight train. In the pre-dawn gloom, he found the man from the factory, loading stained tablecloths into an industrial washer. The man didn't speak. He simply pointed to a large canvas laundry cart. Alex dropped the pen deep into the pile of dirty linens. The man nodded once and turned back to his machine. The exchange had taken less than 10 seconds. Thursday arrived, thick with humidity and a tension so palpable it felt like a physical weight. Today was the day. Alex's role was simple but critical. Create a significant diversion that would draw all eyes, especially Vargas's, for at least 90 seconds. That's all the time Elena had calculated she would need. He chose the factory's cedar aging room, a vast, climate-controlled chamber that was Diaz's pride and joy. It was a holy place for cigar aficionados, filled with floor-to-ceiling racks of cedar trays holding thousands of aging cigars. The smell was heavenly. A rich, complex aroma of Spanish cedar and fermenting tobacco. As Diaz explained the delicate balance of humidity and temperature. Alex, feigning intense interest, leaned in close to one of the hygrometers on the wall. His hand, holding a small notebook, brushed against the main sprinkler head on the ceiling pipe directly above them. It was an old brass fixture. Tucked into his palm was a powerful custom-made Zippo lighter from TSD. Its flame adjusted to burn almost invisibly hot with a focused blue jet. He flicked it on. The tiny, concentrated flame touched the sprinkler's fusible link. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a soft pop, the link melted. The deluge was instantaneous and violent. A torrent of foul-smelling, rust-colored water erupted from the ceiling, drenching Alex, Diaz, and, most satisfyingly, Captain Vargas. An alarm bell began to clang loudly and discordantly throughout the factory. Workers started shouting. It was chaos. "My cigars!" Diaz shrieked, his face a mask of genuine horror. "They will be ruined." Vargas, sputtering, his immaculate uniform soaked and stained, was instantly galvanized into action. He barked orders, directing workers to shut off the main water valve and cover the precious cigar racks. His attention, and the attention of every security guard in the building, was focused entirely on the disaster in the aging room. Alex had his 90 seconds. He could only pray that Elena was using hers. On the other side of the factory, on the rolling floor, the alarm bell was a starting gun. Elena's heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady. Years of practice had given her an economy of motion that bordered on supernatural. The medio tiempo leaves, dark, oily, and precious, were on a special tray on her workbench, set aside for the 10 master rollers assigned to the Comandante's private stock. She pulled the fountain pen from the folds of her apron. Her movements were a seamless part of her work, invisible to a casual observer. She picked up a leaf. Her thumb pressed the hidden actuator on the side of the pen as the nib touched the leaf's surface. A tiny, invisible droplet was dispensed. She placed the dosed leaf on a specific pile. Pick up another leaf. Touch. Dose. Place. Her hands were a blur of controlled, efficient motion. She dosed 20 leaves, enough for a full box of 25 cigars, allowing for some to be mixed in with untreated leaves. It was more than enough. She slipped the pen back into her apron. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 47 seconds had passed. By the time Vargas had restored order in the aging room, his uniform dripping, his face a thundercloud of raw suspicion, Elena was calmly rolling a cigar, her pile of dosed leaves already mixed in with the hundreds of others on her bench. There was nothing to see. Alex, meanwhile, was playing the part of the mortified, clumsy foreigner to perfection, apologizing profusely to Diaz, offering to pay for any and all damages. Vargas stared at him, water dripping from the brim of his cap onto his sharp nose. He knew it was sabotage. He just couldn't prove it. The heat from a lighter wouldn't leave a trace. It was a perfect, untraceable act of industrial mischief. The final deal was signed the next day. Alex, as Finch, agreed to purchase a massive shipment of second-tier cigars, a deal that made Diaz and the Cuba Tobacco officials ecstatic. It was the perfect cover for his hasty departure. As he was being driven back to Havana, he saw Vargas one last time, standing at the gates of the factory, watching the car until it disappeared from sight. The captain's face was unreadable, but Alex knew with absolute certainty that this was not over. The exfiltration was clean. He flew from Havana to Mexico City, then to London, where he spent 2 days establishing Alistair Finch's return before shedding the identity forever and taking a military transport from RAF Lakenheath back to a quiet airbase in Virginia. Frank was waiting for him on the tarmac. There was no praise, no congratulations. That wasn't the way it worked. "The package is on its way," was all he said, the words fogging in the cool night air. Cuba Tobacco's premier diplomatic shipment. It's scheduled to be delivered to the Palace of the Revolution on Friday. They waited. The entire Cuba desk waited. It was a quiet, agonizing vigil. The intelligence came in drips and drabs from assets in Havana. The box of cigars, a specially made cedar box with the Comandante's initials, FCR, burned into the lid, had been delivered. It had been accepted by his personal aide. It was now in his private study, in his personal humidor. Friday night. Langley was a ghost town, most of the personnel gone for the weekend. Alex sat with Frank in the sterile communications room, a pot of stale, burnt coffee between them. They were monitoring diplomatic channels, listening for any chatter, any anomaly. Nothing. Hours ticked by. Midnight. 1 a.m. Maybe he didn't smoke one, Frank grumbled, rubbing his tired, bloodshot eyes. Maybe he gave the box away as a gift. He wouldn't, Alex said, his voice certain. That batch is his personal brand. It's a status symbol. He shares them, but he always smokes the first one from a new box himself. At 2:17 a.m., a red light blinked on a secure teletype machine. The machine began to clatter, the sound deafening in the silent room. A Priority 1 cable from the Havana station chief. It was short, cryptic. Palace in lockdown. Ambulances on site. Rumors of sudden, violent illness in inner circle. Source mentions shouting paranoia. El Comandante's voice identified. Standing by. A slow, predatory grin spread across Frank's face. He looked at Alex, and, for the first time, there was a glimmer of genuine respect in his eyes. "You did it, Thorne. You magnificent bastard. You actually did it." The full story emerged over the next 48 hours, pieced together from panicked sources and terrified eyewitnesses inside the palace. Castro had been holding a late-night meeting with his brother Raul Che Guevara and 3 of his most trusted generals. He had opened the new box of cohibas with a flourish, praising their aroma and construction. He had lit his own, taken a long, satisfying puff, and leaned back in his chair to begin his speech. The effect of the BZ, aerosolized in the thick blue smoke, had been rapid and devastating. It began with a subtle disorientation. According to the source, a trembling palace aide, Castro's eyes had widened. He had suddenly stopped mid-sentence and accused Che of staring at him, his voice rising in pitch. He stood up, knocking over his chair, and began pacing the room, swatting at invisible insects he claimed were crawling on his skin. Then the auditory hallucinations began. He claimed to hear American jets overhead. He started shouting orders to Air Defense Command on a phone that wasn't connected. The generals, also beginning to feel the effects from the ambient smoke, were gripped by their own paranoid delusions. One drew his sidearm and accused the others of being CIA infiltrators. Another began weeping uncontrollably in a corner. Raul, a heavy drinker, was reportedly less affected, but was utterly bewildered by the sudden, collective descent into madness. It was Che, the doctor, who first realized they had been drugged. He tackled the general with the pistol while shouting for the guards. The palace was sealed. Doctors were rushed in, but they could find nothing physically wrong. By the time the sun rose, the effects of the chemical had worn off, leaving the leaders of the Cuban Revolution exhausted, confused, and deeply, profoundly unnerved. The mission was a success beyond their wildest dreams. Castro had not been killed. He had been rendered a raving, paranoid lunatic in front of the 5 most important men in his regime. The seeds of doubt and mistrust had been sown. The legend of the infallible Comandante had been shattered, if only for an hour, and if only for a handful of people. The joke had been told. Alex felt a grim satisfaction, but it was hollow. He kept thinking of Elena. The CIA's promise had been to secure the release of her brother, a political prisoner in the notorious Isla de Pinos prison. Alex pushed Frank on it for weeks. "It's being handled," Frank would say, waving him off. "These things take time, back channels." But Alex knew the agency's promises were written in disappearing ink. 3 months after the operation, he used a secure, off-the-books contact, a favor owed from his old Berlin days, to make an inquiry. The answer came back a week later, a single sentence on a burnt piece of paper delivered to his postbox. "Elena Royas, arrested by DGI 1 week after your departure. No further information. Her brother died of typhoid in prison 2 months ago." The words hit him like a physical blow. Vargas. The captain had known. He couldn't prove Alex was a spy, but he had watched. He had put the pieces together. The clumsy tourist, the broken sprinkler, the sudden departure, and he had traced it all back to the one person who had been in the right place at the right time. Elena. Alex had not only failed to save her brother, he had handed her a death sentence. The final bitter twist came a year later, from a defector, a high-ranking DGI officer who had been part of Vargas's team. The defector's debriefing report, bound in a plain blue cover, landed on Alex's desk. He read it under the harsh fluorescent lights of the records room, his hands trembling slightly. The defector confirmed the events of that night in the palace. The chaos, the paranoia, the madness. It had all happened exactly as their asset had reported. But there was one crucial detail the asset had gotten wrong. One detail that changed everything. Fidel Castro, famously paranoid about assassination attempts after hundreds of plots by the CIA, had a standing rule. Whenever a new, untested supply of anything, food, drink, or especially his beloved cigars, arrived, he would never be the first to sample it. It was a matter of personal security, a protocol born of endless attempts on his life. That night, with his inner circle around him, he had opened the beautiful cedar box and, as a sign of ultimate respect and trust, offered the very first cigar not to himself, but to his most loyal and celebrated commander, Ernesto Che Guevara. Castro had watched, his own cigar unlit, as his friend took the first puff. He had watched as the man's legendary composure dissolved, as his eyes filled with terror, as he began screaming about traitors and invisible insects. The CIA had succeeded in driving a man mad with a drugged cigar. They had just gotten the wrong man. Their bullet had hit the person standing next to the king. And in doing so, they had inadvertently confirmed Castro's deepest, most justified paranoias, making him more cautious, more ruthless, more entrenched than ever before. The joke, it turned out, had been on them. Alex Thorne closed the file, the weight of it all settling upon him like a shroud. He thought of the salt spray in the Florida Straits, the cold, knowing look in Vargas's eyes, and the quiet dignity of a woman at a rolling table in Pinar del Rio. He had been part of a ghost story, a secret history written in smoke and betrayal. And he knew, with a certainty that would haunt him for the rest of his life, that he was the one who was truly a ghost, forever trapped in the echo of a failed punchline.